Good evening, I'm Nima and this is Forum Daily for Tuesday, May 17th. We begin the cast on the East Coast. Prince Charles and his wife Camilla are in Newfoundland and Labrador's capital today. They're kicking off a 3-day Canadian tour focused on Indigenous reconciliation and climate change. The royal couple were welcomed by the Prime Minister and the Governor-General in St. John's. They attended a reconciliation prayer with Indigenous leaders today and toured the former fishing community of Kitividi. They will also visit Ottawa and the Northwest Territories this week. Well, the president of the Association for Canadian Studies is sounding the alarm on racist content online. He says the degree of young people's exposure to such content should be a cause for concern. This comes after a recent survey found more than 50% of Canadians under age 35 come across racist or prejudiced remarks about immigrants on the internet. Non-white respondents were more likely to say they encountered racist remarks online. Meanwhile, Federal Natural Resources Minister Jonathan Wilkinson is making moves to expand Canada's energy industry. He has urged the U.S. Senate Committee on Energy and Natural Resources to embrace the idea of a Canada-U.S. energy powerhouse. The committee also heard from Alberta Premier Jason Kenney this morning. He urged senators to try to convince Michigan to abandon its legal battle against the Line 5 pipeline. And he promoted the idea of a new bilateral pipeline project to help both countries establish energy security. Well, this all comes as the national average price for regular gas is sitting at a record high of $2.06 a liter. But that pales in comparison with the $2.33 per liter price this morning at some stations in Vancouver. BC's opposition parties are calling on the NDP government to make public transit free for the next 4 months to help take cars off the road or to suspend the provincial gas tax. Staying in Vancouver now, where a food bank program says it had to stop accepting new clients. This comes after it saw a 10-fold increase in demand since the COVID-19 pandemic began. The City Reach Care Society's Food for Families program provides fresh food to those in need and distributes to 5 sites across the region. Executive Director Simon Gao says having to limit the number of people the Society helps is heartbreaking, and he's hoping for more volunteers and financial donations to expand services. He says the Society serves about 1,000 families a week, which is up from 100 before the pandemic. Disruptions at the largest baby formula maker in the U.S. are causing supply issues for specific hypoallergenic formulas across Canada. But parents in Quebec are noticing shortages of other formulas on the province's pharmacy shelves as a result of panic buying. A Retail Council of Canada spokeswoman says some retailers have put limitations in place in terms of what customers can purchase. Abbott said yesterday that it has reached an agreement with American health officials to restart production at its Michigan factory, which is a key step toward easing the shortage. Moving to Ontario now, where Progressive Conservative leader Doug Ford was in the hot seat at last night's provincial election debate. But he largely refused to take the bait. Instead, he referred back to his own messages of building infrastructure and affordability. One of the sharpest criticisms came from Green Party leader Mike Schreiner. He laid into Mr. Ford over what he called the Tory leader's disrespect for nurses as premier, including capping compensation increases for public sector workers. The federal government is reviewing the 2018 legislation that legalized vaping. And it appears to be veering away from the narrow path between treating vapes as a harm reduction tool or being just as dangerous as using tobacco. The harms of vaping relative to smoking tobacco cigarettes are still something of a mystery, but the government's website suggests that it's safer than inhaling cigarette smoke. Tobacco use is still the leading cause of preventable death and disease in Canada, and studies suggest vaping remains relatively unpopular for anyone older than 25. But has spiked for 15 to 19-year-olds. The Toronto Maple Leafs are confirming reports that Mitch Marner was the victim of a carjacking. Mr. Marner wasn't hurt when 3 men, armed with 2 handguns and a knife, stole his Range Rover outside a Toronto movie theater last evening. Just yesterday, York Regional Police released a video about car hijackings being on the rise in the Greater Toronto area. All right, well, first it was Tim Biebs, and now it's Biebs Brew. Tim Hortons is rolling out the next phase of its collaboration with Canadian pop star Justin Bieber. It says the French vanilla-flavored cold brew is inspired by his sweet tooth. Bieb's brew will be available at Tim Hortons restaurants starting June 6th. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Climate change continues to be a hot topic among officials as Canada prepares to launch its first ever national strategy to adapt to climate change. On Monday, the federal government launched a public engagement process to hear input from Canadians regarding how to prepare for climate-related disasters. Well, this comes as flash flooding from heavy rain last week, combined with melting snow, has overtopped roads and damaged bridges and culverts in western Manitoba. And flooding isn't the only concern. The federal government says it's preparing for what could be a challenging summer of wildfires in parts of the country, especially in BC. Well, joining us now to give us a deeper look at how climate change has impacted Canada is Mr. Julius Lindsay, the Director of Sustainable Communities at the David Suzuki Foundation. Sir, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thanks for having me.
Now, we mentioned some of the climate-related weather disasters that are impacting Manitoba and BC, but what other provinces have been impacted by climate change so far?
I think it's clear to say at this point that all provinces are being affected by climate change, and some of the extreme weather that we're seeing in Saskatchewan and Manitoba and BC right now, we saw in Ontario, where I'm located, over the past few years, and there was also a very large flood in Alberta a number of years back, and so we see this pattern of these extreme weather events happening across the country.
And how have the federal and provincial governments responded to such disasters? I guess the bigger question here would be whether such responses were enough.
Well, I think the federal and provincial governments have responded by providing aid and providing funds, but really it's municipalities and the local communities that are the most affected and who have to shoulder some of the cost of the cleanup and the impacts from infrastructure. Municipalities in Canada own 60 to 70% of infrastructure and are responsible for it. So a lot of these impacts and effects are being paid for from municipalities fixing and addressing these challenges.
And throughout the years, as you mentioned, we've seen wildfires, floods, heat domes, a lot of things happening across the country. But what would you say is the biggest environmental threat to Canada so far?
Well, I think climate change in general is the biggest environmental threat to Canada, and as we've seen, these impacts continue to happen. The costs and the damages continue to grow over the years, and it's something that we really, as a country, have to address and contemplate how we are going to address these effects and try and adapt to some of these changes and some of these disasters that we've already seen and the ones that we will see in the future.
All right, Mr. Lindsay, what are you hoping will be covered in the federal climate change adaptation plan?
Well, I'm really hoping that there's going to be a very robust piece around data. We need to understand where these risks are, how they will happen, how likely they are to happen. And that's really starts with the data that we have that underpins how we look at climate change. The second, as I said earlier, is climate change adaptation and impacts are really very locally focused. And so ways to connect with those local communities, ways to support those local communities in addressing climate change and adaptation, and specifically, especially from our infrastructure perspective, is really something that I'm hoping to see in the plan. And I think the last piece that I'm really hoping to see in the plan is cross-country coordination. These impacts are very local and they happen differently in different places, but we need to be coordinated and ambitious in the way that we address climate change adaptation.
So what does an adaptation strategy mean for the overall fight to prevent further impacts from climate change?
Well, it really means it's about preparedness. there's a statistic that says that for every dollar we spend in preparation, we save $3 in terms of how much the impacts that we see. And so it's really about preparedness. It's really about understanding, as I said before, what those impacts are, where they might be, and then how we might address them. And that comes down to sort of very local level. It comes down to the various impacts that we might see, from flooding to heat to ice storms, and really understanding how that might affect the areas that we're in, and then building those strategies for how we can adapt to those changes that we're going to see in the future.
All right, Mr. Lindsay from the David Suzuki Foundation, thank you again for joining us today on Forum Daily.
Thank you for having me.
Stay with us. Coming up after the break, we continue to look at the national climate change policy, but this time from an insurance perspective. We'll be speaking with Craig Stewart, the Vice President of Climate Change and Federal Issues at the Insurance Bureau of Canada, to discuss how Canada must adapt to protect citizens and communities from extreme weather and to reduce their carbon footprint. Of course, after that, we'll have more news from around the world, so stay with us. We'll be right back shortly on Forum Daily News. Environment Minister Stephen Guilbeault has launched the final development phase for the national strategy on adapting to climate change. Experts say Canada needs to do more to prepare infrastructure for the threats of extreme weather and get faster at helping Canadians recover from floods, fires, and other major storms. The plan is supposed to show how Canada can become more resilient to the effects of climate change, and it'll include a national monitoring and evaluation system. This while the Insurance Bureau of Canada says Canada must respond by adapting to keep citizens and communities out of harm's way and by reducing their carbon footprint. Well, with us now to discuss the national climate change strategy from an insurance perspective is Mr. Craig Stewart, Vice President of Climate Change and Federal Issues at IBC. Sir, welcome to Forum Daily.
Great to be here. Thanks, Nima.
So how much money do climate-related disasters actually cost the federal and provincial governments each year?
Well, the numbers have kept going up and up and up. So in 2015, the numbers were more around $1 billion a year. But last year alone, the floods that occurred in November in British Columbia are expected to cost about $5 billion in uninsured losses. And then with regards to insured losses, of course, those numbers make the total even higher.
And what about individual Canadians and businesses? What does it cost them?
So for Canadians right now, many Canadians actually shoulder the cost of climate change through their taxes, through their insurance policies, and they get directly hit because, frankly, insurance doesn't cover the most frequent events, which are flood events. And so a lot of Canadians end up paying, unfortunately, out of pocket. So overall, it's costing us all, whether you're in private business, you're a government agency, or you're just an individual that owns a home.
So everyone's being impacted. Now, in terms of the insurance industry in particular, how have these climate events impacted insurance?
So globally, these events have been on the rise, both in terms of the number of severe events that we've been seeing year in and year out, and in the total cost. Back in about 20 years ago, these costs were about $400 million a year. Each and every year, we're looking at about $2 billion in insured losses on an annualized basis. And we just expect the numbers to go up from here.
Some very shocking numbers there. Now, we know IBC says Canada should respond by keeping citizens and communities out of harm's way. So how can officials go about doing that?
Well, what we'd like to see is essentially targeted action to try to remove, or help protect those Canadians that we know are living in undefended areas across the country. So, for example, those that are living in boreal forest who are at high risk of wildfires, particularly in British Columbia, year in and year out. Those that live on floodplains where we know they're going to flood. Some of them have a 5% chance of flooding in any given year. With those folks, we actually know what to do. Whether it's to reduce vegetation close to a house in a boreal community, putting fire impervious shingles on the roof. or in a floodplain. If you're living in a floodplain, either frankly relocating people who shouldn't be there in the first place, elevating homes, changing the landscaping so the water is going to drain away from the house. There's a lot that we can do, but it takes investment. And that's what we're calling on governments to do, in partnership with municipalities and homeowners.
And the responsibility to adapt to this climate change is not only falling on federal officials or provincial officials, it also falls on businesses and individual communities working together in this fight. So what steps can both industries and citizens take?
So the private sector can do a lot. So, insurance companies obviously play a role in educating homeowners and businesses that they insure about the risk that they face. We can also provide premium incentives to, just as we do with fire, to reward individuals for taking those steps to protect themselves. Banks can be doing more in terms of mortgage incentives. Realtors can be doing more as far as disclosing the risk of a home when in a real estate transaction. We need to become innovative. There's a lot that frankly the private sector can be doing, and then for consumers, it's about educating themselves. Getting a sense of, are they at risk? Are they not? Consulting municipal maps online, talking to their insurer, getting detail to understand better the degree of risk that they might face and the steps that they can take to protect themselves.
A very informative conversation, sir. Thank you again for joining us today on Forum Daily.
Thank you very much, Nima, for having me.
Up next, we've got more news from across the world, of course. Ukraine completes its evacuation of injured forces from a steel plant in Mariupol. We'll have more on that story and more news coming up next. Russia is calling it a mass surrender, while Ukraine says its garrison completed its mission. More than 260 Ukrainian fighters defending a steel plant in Mariupol were evacuated to areas controlled by Russian-backed separatists, and officials are working to get the rest out. The complete capture of the plant gives Russia its biggest victory of the war yet. It could help free up forces for offensive action in eastern Ukraine's industrial heartland, which is now Russia's focus after a series of setbacks. Meanwhile, Finland's parliament has voted 188 to 8 in favor of the country seeking NATO membership. The vote was largely a formality, but both President Sauli Niinistö and Prime Minister Sanna Marin stressed that it was important for the parliament vote, which they described as historic. Finland is now expected to sign a formal application and file it to NATO headquarters together with Sweden, which announced a similar NATO bid yesterday. Moving to Costa Rica now, where a ransomware gang that infiltrated some government computer systems has upped its threat. It now says its goal is to overthrow the government. The Russian-speaking Conti gang attacked Costa Rica in April. They accessed multiple critical systems in the finance ministry, including customs and tax collection. The U.S. State Department has offered a $10 million reward for information leading to the identification or location of Conti leaders. In Lebanon, final results for weekend parliamentary elections are out, and they show that the militant Hezbollah group and its allies have lost the majority of parliament seats they held since 2018. Their most vocal opponents and more than a dozen independents have made gains. The Interior Ministry released the final results on Tuesday. The Hezbollah-led coalition ended up winning 61 seats in the 128-member legislature. Now, that's a drop of 10 members since the last vote was held 4 years ago. Sunday's parliamentary elections are the first since Lebanon's economic meltdown began in late 2019. All right, turning to the British government now, which is vowing to pass a law to change the Brexit treaty that it signed with the EU less than 2 years ago. This only if the two sides can reach an agreement to end a dispute over post-Brexit trade rules. The EU is accusing Prime Minister Boris Johnson of trying to wriggle out of the deal, which was supposed to keep the Irish land border free of customs posts and other checks. But in order to protect the EU's single market, there are checks on some goods, such as meat and eggs, entering Northern Ireland from the rest of the United Kingdom. COVID cases in Beijing have authorities restricting more residents to their homes. This in a now 3-week-long effort to control a small but persistent COVID-19 outbreak in the Chinese capital. 7 adjoining areas in the city's Fengtai district were designated lockdown zones for at least 1 week. The added restrictions come as Shanghai slowly starts to ease a citywide lockdown that has trapped most of its population for more than 6 weeks. The twin outbreaks in Beijing and Shanghai have focused attention on whether China can sustain its strict zero-COVID approach. Meanwhile, Tesla CEO Elon Musk says his deal to buy Twitter can't move forward unless the company provides its number of fake accounts. Mr. Musk wants public proof that less than 5% of the accounts on the platform are fake or spam. He made the comment in a reply to another user on Twitter early this morning. He spent much of yesterday in a back and forth with Twitter CEO Paraj Agarwal, who posted a series of tweets explaining his company's efforts to fight bots. Zimbabwe is seeking international support to be allowed to sell its stockpile of seized ivory. It says the $600 million that it expects to earn is urgently needed for the conservation of its rapidly growing elephant population, which it describes as dangerous. Zimbabwean officials showed EU ambassadors the collection of ivory seized from poachers or collected from dead elephants, and they encouraged European envoys to support the sale of the ivory, which is banned by CITES, the international body that monitors endangered species. Buckingham Palace is calling Queen Elizabeth's surprise visit to Paddington Station in central London a happy development. The Queen wore a yellow outfit with matching hat and carried a cane as she went to see a newly completed subway line named in her honor. The 96-year-old's public appearances are being closely watched. This comes as the UK prepares to celebrate her 70 years on the throne, with 4 days of Platinum Jubilee festivities starting June 2nd. All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. Take care, Canada. We'll see you next time on Forum Daily News.